Well, hello, and welcome to the Trailblazer webinar, Reshaping the Owner-Operator Relationship. My name's Eloise Hanson. I'm the editor of Boutique Hotel News. We are an online B2B multimedia platform for boutique, lifestyle, and luxury hotels. A few webinar guidelines before we begin. We're going to spend around 45 minutes in discussion with our Trailblazers today, followed by 15 minutes at the end for any questions from the floor. So guys who are attending, if you would like to ask any questions, please submit these using the Q&A function, and I'll get round to these at the end. And as a reminder, this webinar is being recorded, and all those that have registered will automatically receive a copy of that recording within a couple of days' time. So one of our sponsors today is Aperto Guest Technologies, and they supplied a short video which we're going to play for you now.
The only thing better than knowing you're onto something good is knowing you're onto something better. Better insights into bookings and property details. Sustainable energy management that protects your bottom line and the environment. Simplified messaging between teams and guests. Content creation tools that grow and monetize your guest experience before and after they check in. And that feeling of, I've got this. Aperto Connect. Your guest experience reimagined.
And further information about Aperto Connect can be found in the chat if you would like to know some more. So here's our Trailblazers today, and I'm going to invite each of them to introduce themselves, and I'm going to begin ladies first. So Felicity, can I hand over to you, please?
Thank you, Eloise. It's a pleasure to be here. I head up the global real estate offering for Watson Farley and Williams across all the offices, but my particular personal focus is on hotels and other operating real estate assets. So whether it's the corporate transactions, the HMAs, the franchises, or the leases, I tend to cover across the board for the hotel sector.
Brilliant. Thanks, Felicity. And Gerard, can I come to you next, please?
Hi. Yes, I run an agency business. Over a long period of time, we've sold about a third of the London market, about 500 hotel transactions. I also chair a investment business, C1 Capital, where we co-invest at own hotels or we asset manage them.
Thank you, Gerard. And David, can I come to you next, please?
Thank you, Elise. Yes. So I'm David Doran, Chief Executive of Resident Hotels. We have effectively a legacy of innovation prior to my time in hotel offer. And on the 4th of February 2019, we launched the Resident. So we now have the Resident 4 in London and 1 in Liverpool. Someone described them the other day as boutique select service or premium select service hotels. What I am delighted to say is that we're fortunate enough to be at the top of the TripAdvisor rankings in London, so clearly getting some good guest appreciation, which is entirely down to wonderful teams across the whole business.
Thank you, David. And last but not least, Ruston.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ruston Vickers. I'm head of the franchise development for Choice Hotels. Surprisingly, perhaps to some, the third biggest hotel company in the world, but not very well known. So my job is to help change that in this part of the world. We have 6,000 hotels in the States and only 400 in Europe, Middle East, Africa. So my job is to grow Choice into this very eclectic region, and delighted to be here because I think it's a very exciting time for the evolution of franchising in the hotel space in this region.
Thank you, Ruston. And all the LinkedIn profiles of our Trailblazers are in the chat for you to connect with. Now, our second sponsor of today is Cvent, and they're hosting a Cvent Connect Europe next week. And the team has kindly supplied a 50% discount code for today's webinar attendees, which you can find in the chat along with the event details. And the Cvent team have also supplied a short teaser video of the event, which we're going to play now. So before we head on to our main conversation today, I'm going to run you through some stories that I've published on Boutique Hotel News that just offer some background to the conversation. Here we have on the far left, AG Group has signed a franchise agreement with Hyatt for 2 properties in Italy, which will become part of Hyatt's Unbound collection and JDV independent brands. Moving into the luxury tier, Rosewood has been selected by F4 Transbay Partners to manage an upcoming hotel in San Francisco, and Thompson Chicago now has new owners and operators. On the next slide, we have an example of changes in flags above the door, as is the case with Mondrian Shoreditch, as it was formerly the Curtain in London. And the far right story shares a report by Brand Finance, which reveals that the world's top 50 hotel brands has declined in value by 33%, which is equivalent to a loss in almost 23 billion US dollars. This was a report that was published earlier this summer, just for context. On the next slide, the Roger in New York has just been bought by new owners, Electra America Hospitality Group, for 19 million US dollars. That's a $71 million discount. And one of the largest lifelines that the UK government has initiated to date is the extension of the rent moratorium to March next year. And at the time of writing this particular story, UK Hospitality estimated there's £2.5 million worth of rent arrears built up by hospitality firms. And lastly, this slide is just an example of the various conversion brands and soft brands that larger hotel chains have launched, which has definitely been in response to the changes in the market and the changes in owners' needs. And this is going to be something that we will talk about today. So, without further ado, let's talk about reshaping the owner-operator relationship. And I'd like to kick off with a question to Gerard. And I'm asking Gerard whether you are able to give us an overview, snapshot of how the pandemic has affected the owner-operator relationship.
Well, I think in my experience, most operators have tried to help. When I say operator, in terms of the branded hotels, the brands have tried to help the operator. From an operator point of view, we took back hotels that we are now operating, but the banks have been pretty supportive. I mean, far more supportive than they ever have in the past. So they were giving interest holidays, capital repayment holidays. I think bottom line is that if a hotel is completely closed down and you're a bank, what do you do? And there's no other banks lending in the market, what do you do? So you kind of have to work with the owners. The acid test will be, as things are recovering, and they seem to be recovering quite rapidly at the moment, will they then take a different view? In our personal case, we were lucky because we were well provided for, so we paid our interest. We even made some capital repayments, believe it or not, and so we were in a secure position, but seen hardly any distress as an operator. And brands have tried to help operators where they can. So yeah, not much distress, and a wall of money waiting to take advantage of alleged distress.
And can you follow up, Gerard, with, again, an overview of the specific ways that collaboration has come about in the negotiations that you're seeing?
So very simplistically, a brand has waived its fees and said, we're not going to charge you the fees, holding back to help hoteliers with their cash flow. So keep hold of the cash, pay us later. I mean, there's so many, lack of forcing foreclosure. So you talk about moratorium, but there's still other people taking you to court. So the court process is there, but we can talk about this with Felicity, but actually taking it back is not there, but you've got the weight of that hanging over you. you know, it's really just cash flow at the end of the day. What do you do with a closed down hotel? The flip side is that you get rid of all your outgoings. So on one of our assets in London, we always went through a scenario where if we close it down, there'll be no outgoings, but we found there were like 200 contracts there that we couldn't get out of. So someone still had to come and maintain the lifts. You can't turn off the water because of Legionnaire's disease. So you have to keep it going, or you drain down the whole system. And so we found a lot of things that we thought we could do that we couldn't do. So that, you know, at one point, flushing 400 toilets a day is a task.
Well, imagine what it was like on some of these cruise ships, because we do a lot in the cruise sector, and they had to keep the staff on the ships literally to go around and do all those tasks Gerard's just been describing.
Yeah.
So it was pretty onerous.
But things like business rates, huge saving. And you see the Labour government announced yesterday, didn't they, that, you know, they're going to try and scrap business rates, at least for small businesses. But, you know, the outgoings, as David will suggest, on just business rates alone on a central London property, you know, we've got almost £5 million a year business rates.
Mm-hmm. And David, I'd like to loop you in here and ask, from your point of view, what are those personal and professional qualities that have actually helped the situation?
Well, I think clearly an awful lot of words that we didn't anticipate ever using or know about have been part of the language since March 2020. But however you describe it, however you welcome government support and thoughtfulness, if you like, even if not perfect, the fact of the matter is that personalities and people are behind the position of landlord and tenant, say, for example, owner, operator, whatever. And it's incredibly important to stay quite calm if you can during something that people really haven't experienced before. And, you know, clearly, as it went on, and as, you know, it wasn't over by Christmas, and then Christmas was, you know, 14 days in December and then cancelled and all the rest of it. You know, clearly this has been an extraordinarily challenging thing that the whole world has been wrestling with. So we shouldn't necessarily perhaps be entirely surprised that there's not a playbook for landlord and tenant or whoever to refer to. So I think that right throughout this, I think it's, and it's still quite challenging. You know, I mean, I came in this morning and there was a queue outside the most expensive petrol station in London that I've never seen in my life. So there's still lots of dysfunctional things going on. So I think the principal things are to try to keep the head, as we'd say, where I'm from, and remain calm and see through it, and at least in the sense of understanding that there will be another side to all of these extraordinary circumstances at the moment. And I think, like Gerard just said, you know, we are seeing a genuine recovery now, having been through very difficult times. And so I think it's also equally important that whilst we have endured terribly gloomy times and existential concerns, equally we can recognize that the recovery will be complicated. It will be challenging and difficult. That it's, you know, we're very, very lucky with lovely teams, as I mentioned at the start in our business. But they're under incredible pressure because people want to come back into London, and expectations, quite rightly, are very high. So delivering on that creates terrible stresses. So our equivalent of the petrol queues is laundry. You know, there are lots of consequences to these things. So I think that it is absolutely crucial that people do try to keep calm and professional and see beyond it and understand that the arrangements that were put in place pre-COVID could not possibly have been anticipated to be enduring with this. So finding the solutions are unlikely to be found in a pre-COVID world. They're going to be found in a living with COVID world.
Mm-hmm. And do you think as a result that owners will likely want more of an active role to play now, and especially in the future as we look to recover and we move through that recovery?
I mean, I think certainly that anybody who's been through this on either side is very information hungry. And the great thing about our industry is actually that information is pretty readily available and is professionally prepared and transparent. So sharing that information is very important, particularly as recovery comes through, to understand the nature of that and what impacts it's actually having genuinely a profit line or not, and the kind of catch up. So I think that sharing that is being transparent is very, very important, basically. And hopefully there's a sort of shared mutual understanding that, you know, at the end of the day, I think that the owners will still want to have a distance from the operational risk. That's what the whole thing was for. But clearly this whole global problem has suddenly shown how close you can be to risk, whatever your documentation says.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. If I can jump on. Sorry,
very quickly. You probably could ask the audience who are listening what they think will happen with those rent arrears, but for the first time ever, from a landlord's point of view, and I was one of them, you have to take into account, at the very least, what if your tenant doesn't survive and is not there, and you will have to take back that operational business. So that adds to David's point of transparency, because there are big institutional landlords saying, when we find out people could pay the rent and they didn't pay the rent, we'll have a very different attitude to them compared to people who couldn't pay the rent and didn't pay the rent. And I'd like to ask everybody listening what they think, because government pushing back, you can't collect rent, but it's pushing back an enormous problem that is going to have to be resolved. Sorry, Ruston.
Exactly. No, perfect. And I all in the same subject. I think what's been fascinating is how COVID has shown that you cannot de-risk hospitality. Hospitality is a secular industry, and as much as specifically in Europe, institutions love to de-risk it, whether it be through leases or through other instruments. I think for me, what's refreshing is that ultimately owners have to be closer to the business. Investors have to be closer to the business. They can't really run things at arm's length, because at the end of the day, you can't just expect to collect a rent check at the end of the month. And I think, again, COVID's proven that, because, well, thankfully there's been some government support. But for me, it's great to hear you guys talk more in the past sense. But I think from a revenue perspective, it's great that business is coming back strong. But I'm really fascinated in the next sort of 6 to 18 months of the fallout that hasn't happened, surprisingly, in the hotel industry from the ownership side, right? So banks haven't wanted to foreclose. Governments have been giving the support. We just saw what you said, the headline for the UK, that it's extended to March 2022. In other parts in Europe, where I'm in Paris right now, there's really a massive withdrawal of support. So revenues are coming in, but they're not coming in as they were pre-COVID. And so fascinating discussions over the next sort of 6 to 18 months of now, who's going to pay the interest and who's going to pay the bill.
Mm-hmm. And echoing the panelists' thoughts here, if there is someone in the audience who would obviously like to share their experience, please feel free to do so. And I'd like to come to Felicity next, please, to ask exactly how contracts and leases have been amended. What have been some of the added measures that have helped support the operator-owner dynamic?
Well, I think it's been touched on already. The government support and the bank support have possibly delayed the inevitable, but they've certainly altered the face of these things. We have seen on some newer leases some turnover rents, and we'll be very careful on the profit calculation with those sort of provisions in your leases. And the pandemic has seen, often driven by CVAs, say a turnover rent for 3 to 5 years, or a softening of rent for a longer term. But I suppose my main concern is what's been pushed to the future. It's the same with brands, and they may have allowed owners to use the FF&E reserve, but when it comes down to it, at what point are they then going to expect the CapEx? So I think to a certain extent, we don't know what we've pushed into the future, which is why the mismatch between buyers and sellers and price expectations is a bit curious at the moment. I agree with Gerard. We see the wall of money out there, but we don't actually see things happening. And the profit-based rent would also mean more open book accounting, which a tenant should expect. And particularly if they deal with a brand, they should have a fair amount of transparency at the moment. So it's still various things happening. I think I'm seeing a little bit more of an index-linked rent than the old-fashioned 5-year rent review type provisions. But there are some other things coming at the same time, not quite creating a perfect storm, but I think creating more cost, which is the ESG concerns, which brands can help with. But you see there's coming into leases now as well, particularly from the big estates. And I think that can be quite harsh on a tenant, particularly when they're coming out of the position they're at the moment. So it's still very much a moving target. Mm. And add in there for some of them, there are some cladding issues. So it's a question of making sure you've got your banks on board. If you're a tenant, that you've got your landlord on board. And at the end of the day, depending on who your landlord is, if it's a pension fund, it's difficult to say the pensioners should be suffering when there is actually money there in order to pay the rent. So it's all a balancing act.
You've just described these changes almost like a moving target and a balancing act. So off the back of that, do you think contracts are going to change a lot post-pandemic? And if they are going to change maybe permanently, in what way are they going to change?
Well, I think in terms of leases, as I've said, we both parties hopefully will have to take the broader look. And David touched on the position of owners having to recognise the position, and I think all the panelists have touched on that the investor stroke owner possibly accepting they're going to have to take an element of risk, whether that's by part of turnover rent, part fixed, part turnover. So I think we will see a change there. I don't think we'll see quite the same traditional pieces that we've seen in the past. I think in terms of management agreements, I'm seeing quite a variety of reactions, but fundamentally, I'm not seeing new management contracts that are vastly different from the old management contracts. So I think the brands are still insisting on their control, however well they've been behaving at the moment, and some have been behaving very well. They are not opening that up, and the role of asset manager will still be crucial. Mm-hmm. So it's just a permanent change. I don't think coming out of the pandemic there has been enough indication that there will be permanent change, but I think in the minds of investors there will be. I think Gerard can probably speak as to that, but investors will have to look at that risk a bit differently.
I think optimistically the wall of equity looking to invest when they're doing their appraisals are doing their appraisals on 2019 trading figures. So they're almost saying for the last 2 years didn't happen, this is the future going forward. They're probably trying to say to themselves that if I was willing to buy something at 5%, it's now 6%, or 4% is now 5%. But because of the competition, they're having to go, I'll go from that 6 aspiration down to 5 because I need to be the winner for the asset that becomes available. So I think really the general public are saying, well, I've sort of saved money, I want to invest money. And we're seeing that reflected in the investment market saying we've got a lot of money. So the next challenge, there's always a challenge, will be interest rates. In my opinion, it's a bit like during lockdown, everybody wanted a haircut, couldn't have a haircut. But after lockdown, they couldn't have 2 haircuts because they got their haircut. So it happened. My hair went long, and then I went back and got my haircut. So the haircut is in theory there, but actually people are saying business goes on, and we've got to get on with it. So the losers at the moment are major in our region, European city centres, Amsterdam, Paris, Madrid, London, and the winners are the kind of staycation market, which probably isn't really sustainable. But the majority of people are going to go, I still want to go to Greece, like Felicity did. I still want to go to Paris. I still want to go to London. I just need to feel I'm safe, and I need to be able to get there efficiently the final thing that's on the edges of all this is the green economy, and will that have an influence on the product? Every facet of our world is changing into the green economy because everybody wants to look to be doing something about it, for sure. And it's at every level: finance, travel, the type of building materials, construction. That is a major impact as well, and a good one, because it'll create more investment.
Thanks, Gerard and Felicity. I'd like to come to Ruston now. I know Gerard has just mentioned both Amsterdam and Paris. I know you're calling in from Paris, having lived in Amsterdam. So, Ruston, from your experience, how has the demands of owners shifted? And do they have a, generally speaking here, like a main concern, a main pinch point?
I think Felicity's touched on it a bit. I think, again, kind of echoing to what I said before, we've had this 18 months of, you know, all hands on deck and just kind of get through it. And I think lots of tough decisions have not yet been made because we haven't seen that fallout. And as I was saying, the next 6 to 18 months, I think from an ownership perspective, there's going to be I think a seismic change, hopefully for the better, a kind of realignment of risk and reward. But we haven't seen that yet. And so owners that we've spoken to, you know, their focus is, well, how do I get my hotel back open? How do I get business back in the door? So we really haven't had that many discussions on, okay, how do I actually fundamentally change my business relationship with you? And again, I think this is where I kind of foresee that the model of de-risking a whole project is kind of been undone by COVID, right? So there has to be more appetite for risk. But the challenge then is with hotels in Europe, because of the cost base and the increasing cost base and all these other elements such as the environmental sustainability that will add further costs for good reason. I think things get quite thin, and that's where I think potentially, and hopefully from a franchisor's perspective, that model kind of comes into play, because I think it's difficult to justify the cost of a management contract or the lack of certainty from a lease. Might as well take full control of your business, which is what the franchise model is, but yet still need to plug into international systems, loyalty programs, and have this kind of hassle-free plug and play. So that allows you to be more efficient. I do say that very much so in our sector that we focus in, which is the mid-scale, right? So perhaps this isn't relevant to luxury or further upscale. But I think what I've realized, and I'm here in Paris today at the Franchise Expo, and you know, all the talks are very specific dollar sums or euro sums as how much can I save if I go with Choice Hotels, right? Because in this segment, it really is. And I think, again, with COVID, even more laser focused as to what is the cost of operation, cost of servicing. And so this is what it comes down to make a hotel sustainable.
Mm-hmm. I definitely think we're perhaps more price sensitive than we were pre-COVID, whether that be trying to save money or having saved money and maybe looking to splurge or buy. But Ruston, as with yourself being from one of the brands here, I'd like to ask you, what is your take on the value of a brand as we return to normality?
Sure. Well, again, first of all, there wasn't any magic wand that the brand could do during COVID. So in a way, I think everyone was in the same boat, and that was quite a nice, refreshing thing, because typically brands get a lot of stick for lack of system delivery, lack of revenue generating initiatives, at least that cover the costs, right? So it kind of put us all back into one boat. And as I said, the discussions now going forward is how can a hotel, for example, an independent hotel today that's gone through COVID, that has cash flow issues potentially, look to plug into a brand that can really kind of, with the bounce back of demand, really do that extra 10 to 15% of demand that they couldn't do necessarily before, or in a more cost-effective way. So it's a combination of revenue driving, but also system savings, and if anything, labor savings. So that's, again, if you plug into a franchise system potentially, or with a brand, you're able to save costs in terms of marketing, in terms of commissions with booking.com, in terms of hiring your revenue manager, because this is something that's then centralized, right? So this is, again, going back to this real pressure on the cost element of running a hotel. And so that's where brands can help. But again, if governments continue to put up restrictions, that is ultimately the biggest barrier to any kind of demand above and beyond what a brand can do in terms of marketing campaigns.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Ruston. And on the topic of brands, I'd like to bring Felicity in here and ask whether you've seen or heard of the relationship between brand and owner changing during COVID.
Well, as I touched on before, some brands have been very good in their short-term measures. But we discussed earlier whether people were seeking to reflag properties. I suppose I should start with saying there's been no suspension of the law of tortious interference. So if you're with some of the bigger brands and you want to talk to another of the bigger brands, you could find yourself in quite a pickle if you're not careful. So having prefaced it with that, I am not convinced by a lot of the soft conversion brands or some of the collection type brands that you're seeing, because I think they are, when the documentation comes through, in many cases, they're fully fledged brands. They're not as sympathetic to the existing property as you would expect them to be. So there's often more negotiation than an owner's necessarily anticipated. But some are being more realistic, and some are looking to try and make their delivery more transparent and to actually stand by it. I know that one or two brands are prepared to offer shorter term contracts, but if you look at say the big 4 or 5 brand operators, I don't see as much from them as one might have hoped for. Mm-hmm. And as I said, I'm still sort of near the edge of my seat, wondering what's going to happen when it comes to the end of this, or indeed some will insist on a sale. They have the right to do a new PIP. So that is going to affect price if they have actually got the right to go in there and insist on a new PIP, particularly coming out of the pandemic.
Are you seeing greater interest in what you call reflagging properties? I think I've seen one instance in London where property actually deflagged and moved away from a soft brand and became fully independent. And I'm wondering if that's something that you're seeing, Felicity.
I think in times like this, it depends on a number of things. It depends what your funding is, because frequently the funders will have more comfort in seeing a brand on a property. That's not quite the same when it's for sale. And it's got to be something seismic to enable you to get out of an existing brand relationship, depending on where you are in the course of the term of the agreement. And changing brands isn't inexpensive. So it's you've got to have a pretty fair offer and know exactly what you're going to be getting, and have some experts, as Joe and David will know, that can actually get the figures pretty clear before you can make that decision and know when the benefit of changing the brands is going to come through. Because you can see amazing figures spoken of, but when it comes to let's put these in the contract as at least a termination right, if not a warranty, then you will get looks of horror and lots of pushback. So,
yeah, I think there's two answers. I think, Felicity, every one of the points is extremely valid, and then there's the marketplace when you're trying to get a capital price. So, if the property is being sold free of brand in major cities like London, there is a premium paid. For numerous reasons, but a couple are, I prefer one brand to another brand. So, I've got a great relationship with Marriott. I don't have a great relationship with Hilton. I want my new hotel to be with Marriott. You will then argue with the new management contract that you can get key money and incentives to help you with your PIP or your refurbishment program. And then probably going all the way down, not down, but to David, you can argue that, well, the independent doesn't pay the fees and therefore delivers a higher bottom line. So there's lots of reasons why with vacant possession, you can get a higher capital price. That may not be the right decision long-term as an owner-operator, but we definitely will get more interest unbranded than branded.
But certainly the key money contributions I see are generally very much slivers. And they're not that substantial in the great. I always wonder whether somebody might be better off going a long term and going it without taking that key money than going with the stronger brand terms and getting the key money. So I think it's always a balance to be found there as well. Sorry, I was interrupting someone.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing. Please, who's?
I was just going to say, it's just sort of interesting listening to these views, because I feel as though, and perhaps this is at the outer edges of consensus, but I really think reputation is going to be hugely important. It always has been. It's been quite difficult to measure in the past. It's much less difficult to measure now. It really should be featuring in the brand metrics, and when people are talking about scale and distribution and any number of things which have been the kind of KPIs of selling the branded story for many, many years, the real thing is I think, I mean, actually, I think, Eloise, you made the comment, you know, people will be careful with their money or how they spend it. And I think it's a very, very sophisticated judgment that people are able to make as to how to enjoy what we now all realize are pretty precious moments on this earth. So I think that in the fulfillment of, if you like, the fulfillment story behind a brand, the actual reputation and the verification of that, I think that's always going to be much more important. And I do wonder, having watched from the sidelines at the big brands creating a profusion of mini brands with any number of new things to sort of semi-describe them as. I mean, the logical extension of that, if there's roughly 60 million people in the UK, there should be 60 million brands by the end of it. It's kind of almost like struggling to find that other elusive bit that they're not maybe not focusing on at the heart of it. And it's sort of incredible, really, to think that, you know, brands that have got I hope I don't get into trouble for this, but they've got the legacy of great people at the heart of them at their foundation. And yet they're kind of doing everything apart, or almost it's become not about the core. The core brands become the corporate entity, not the actual experience. And I think that's quite revealing. And I think it's really interesting territory for independent hotels to think about, you know, really think quite seriously about, it is important that my hotel, if you're just an owner and you're wanting someone to manage it, it's important that my hotel is really well regarded by my guests and by my team. You know, we don't say staff anymore, and we shouldn't. It's a peer-to-peer mutual respect. People are having great difficulty in recruiting into the industry at the moment because it's one way or another, there's all sorts of big reasons, but also it's got to be a really good place to work. And so these are the sort of things that I think are really important for owners to think about, however distant they want to be within the model from the actual operation. And I think it's a major opportunity, to be honest, in the recovery as it comes. The visibility of reputation from your guests and from your teams are something that a number of our peers are very proud of, and so are we. And is genuine. I think is genuinely the playing field that it should be on. You know, I mean, it's frankly of very little interest to know that there are many tens of thousands of these rooms all over the world. If you're really wanting to have an experience you can trust, and that word's been used a lot as well out of the back of COVID. You know, I mean, you can tell the petrol queues, they don't trust the government story today, do they?
That's really interesting, actually, because I think particularly when you think all of us who've seen that main stage at Berlin from time to time, and a number of brands represented there, and the word guest isn't mentioned very often, and the word owner is virtually never mentioned, and neither are the rest of the team. So I think that's I'm with David on that one. It is time for a bit more openness, a bit more trust, and for everyone in the stack to have some regard, or us to have regard for them.
Mm-hmm. Whilst I was with you, David, earlier, may I pick you up on some advice? You highlighted that the resident has a very strong historical performance, and as an independent operator, I'm wanting to know what would be your advice to another independent operator who's looking to maybe future-proof their business?
It's really difficult to answer a future-proofing I think we tried to dilute it down to future ready, maybe, or something like that. It sounds a bit like a television. But I think it really goes back to probably where I was just now. I think the reality of operating businesses, which are daily trading businesses, has been thrown into real light when literally we were all told to close on the 23rd of March 2020 originally. And the pubs have been told to close literally on the 20th of March 2020. So in terms of being, I mean, clearly we all hope that we're not going to be dealing with multiple global shutdowns in the future, but it has been a reminder of really a lot of the good work that's done on career development, learning, training. I mean, I would be looking very closely at all of that if I was an owner, and understanding what is this management, if this management contract is purely a dialogue about marketing fees or not, or various other little bits like that, I would be a little bit kind of, well, maybe it suits me because I think that, we've seen it work extremely well for us. I genuinely believe it's incredibly important to be looking after your teams and looking after your guests. They're one and the same, effectively. And I think the future is, I think the future is actually immensely positive. It's just really difficult at the moment. But I think it's immensely positive, and I think, I think that a lot of the multi-brand approaches by the big guys will start. It'll change. I can't see that kind of carrying on.
We learned it was really about great service at every level. So when I visited our hotels and they were empty and we were the owner operator, I'll describe myself as the investor. Someone on reception was willing to come out and make me a cup of coffee and genuinely pleased to see me. So it was little things like that. And then showing respect for the people who clean the rooms. I mean, people at the beginning were totally in fear of coming in and cleaning your room. And, people cleaning a room or even in an office were not highly paid. You could see the fear in their eyes, and they had to come into work to clear out your dustbin or change your bed, or, so credit to them. So that kind of respect for people who've, had to really put their health and their family's health on the line by coming to work, I thought was a life experience for all of us, to appreciate people from the NHS just to the office cleaner, to the lorry driver, to whatever.
Unfortunately, I think that people haven't learned as much from the pandemic as one would have hoped, and that the guests aren't always as sympathetic as they might be. And I do think that it's really important for us all to look at our staff and actually support them, because I've known a couple of instances of people leaving jobs in hospitality because they found dealing with the public so much more stressful post-pandemic.
Actually, earlier in this series, I hosted a webinar called Where Have All the Staff Gone? And I have an upcoming webinar, one called The Changing Role of the General Manager, another called Promoting Careers in Hospitality, because it is such a big issue at the moment. And I think more needs to be said and done within this space. But we are getting slightly off topic here.
Can I just say one thing? Sorry, Alice, you talked about future. One of the things I think I said a bit about at the start, but obviously, I've inherited a legacy created by others of innovation, which everybody within the company enormously respects. And, I, from my own experience, know how difficult it is to start off and create things and bring new ideas in. So on your point about future-proofing, I just think there can be a legacy that you can build on. And I think, the fact is the future's in front of you, so you can influence it. And that's what my predecessors have done and what my owners have done throughout.
Thank you. I'd like to come back to Gerard for my next question, because in a webinar that we ran earlier this year, we held a poll, and 57% of the audience voted that owners are in the driving seat when it comes to the balance of power with operators. I'd like to ask you, Gerard, what can operators do to address that balance?
Well, I think It just really depends. It's almost a question, Felicity, because it just depends when you say owners in what capacity they are. So if they had a lease, they probably have got more empowerment because the rent is likely to be in arrears, but they just have to wait for that to happen, so they can change the circumstances. If you're an operator on a management contract, you might argue that you are relatively robust because the owner on a management contract had to deal with all the outgoings, all the costs, and actually, you know, you might have been okay on your base fee if you collected it. And I think Ruston can answer it from a franchisee point of view. What he was saying to us earlier was that, well, actually, you know, people are beginning to realise, why am I relying on a lease which is 50% or 2/3 of the profit when I can take 90% of the profit by granting a franchise? What's the material difference, particularly in the limited service budget sector where it's effectively a bed factory? So it's difficult to give a black and white answer. I would still say overall that an owner of the real estate has probably got more power, far more options than they used to have to decide, do I go down the lease model, the franchise model, the management model? He's got those choices. And back to Felicity, she will advise them accordingly that how they can change that contract. So, you know, one of the leading brands who are supposed to be rock solid on rent payments and pride themselves on the strength of their covenant decided before Christmas that they would only pay 50% of the rent. And that created both opportunity for owners and concern for owners and their banking covenants, etc., because they made a blanket decision, and then probably to this day are still negotiating, but I know initially were negotiating with all their landlords, because some landlords said, you don't want to pay the rent, that's great, I want you to go, and others said, no, I need you to pay the rent. So, you know, there isn't a black and white answer, I'm afraid, but for sure, everything has been reassessed at every level post-COVID.
I think a running theme or trend throughout this conversation and others is the need for flexibility and the need to be understanding and meet those flexible needs. And Gerard, I'd like to stay with you for my next question about what can owners do to protect their investment with flexible lease structures?
The first question to ask yourself is, have I got the ability to run this hotel myself or find someone to run it for me? If the answer to that is yes, you as an owner have got the upper hand. I think the second question that is looming for all of us, and particularly Felicity, is that what happens when you are able to recover past income due to you, that you have the power of taking back the property? Because to me, that is years and years of court litigation that will go on and on and on and on and on, and that no one can compete with it. So I personally think there'll have to be some kind of write-off, and it's a big step to take. And if you do make that decision, you have to try and, as a government, bring the banks with you to be able to say, well, you can't take back the keys because either landlord never recover the money. I can't see 2 years worth of problems being solved over the next 20 years by saying to operators, take your time to pay me back. It's just like, it's going to be difficult. So I don't know is the easy answer to tell you. Pass it on to the rest of the panel.
Well, Felicity, I'd like to pick you up and then ask, obviously, legal restrictions, at least furlough, I believe, is ending September, and there's other legal restrictions that are falling away early next year. So what would be your advice for both owners and operators to support their business when this happens?
Well, initially, I always say you've got to talk, whether it's talking to your bank, whether it's talking to your landlord, it's keeping the line of communication open, because you're more likely to have trust if you're doing that. And if you could pay the rent but choose not to, and relying on the moratorium, you can still be sued in debt. But I think Gerald referred to that earlier. So if your landlord is unhappy enough with you, they will do that. I don't get the impression that the banks are sitting poised to try and do evil things to people that haven't been paying them back. I think they're taking quite a sensible approach, and they're not as exposed as they were in sort of 2010 time. But I think certainly cash is king, and reducing unnecessary costs, innovating where you can, being prepared for what capex you've got to spend in order to keep the door open, the place appealing. So I think there are a number of things that people are doing and can do, but it's negotiating. Well, throughout the pandemic, most people should have looked at every single contract they've got to see what they can negotiate, as Gerard did, to see what needs to be done and to see what you've got to stick by and what you don't necessarily have to stick by. Talking to your brand, if you've got a brand in there, to make sure that you're getting the most out of them and they're not being more favourable to some of their other clients than they are to you. And making sure that you're seeing where the next trend is going, where the next bunch of guests are going to come from. But in the meantime, I think it's all down to cash.
Thanks, Felicity.
Just to say very quickly on that, Felicity touched on a very important point. The banks were very forgiving on their covenants. So if their loan to value was supposed to be 60%, and during COVID allegedly it went up to 80%, you know, they didn't enforce, and that's probably, as you start to come out, business recovers, you need that continued support to say, well, look, now the cash is coming in. I can't instantly wave a magic wand and say the value is back, but I can tell you that, you know, business is coming back, and I will be in that position in a year or 18 months' time, and that support is definitely will continue to be required.
Yeah, if I can just add on that, like I touched on before, I think that's where the biggest fallout in the next sort of 6 to 18 months is driven by the banks, who have been absolutely super supportive throughout all of this. And again, it's been nice because I think it's brought the industry together in what this topic of this webinar is about, is realigning that relationship. So I think there's more of a balance going forward, hopefully. Of course, there'll be some tense conversations ahead, but I think that the banks' patience may run out. It'd be interesting to see, because ultimately they don't really want to foreclose. They don't want to force sales, especially if the asset is still valued pre, you know, or post-COVID. But they'll probably look to change the fundamental operation of the hotel in order to generate more cash flow for their interest payments, right? So they'll push the ownership to look to ways to realign with brands, whether that's shift from management contract to franchise, or to, you know, renegotiate the lease. It'd be lovely to hear what Felicity thinks in terms of management contracts. For me, I think this is the beginning of the end of management contracts, because you're either one end of the spectrum, you're trying to de-risk completely with the lease, or you operate it under a franchise potentially. But I don't see the real need for management contracts anymore, depending how you are as an owner.
I have been wondering for quite a while what the actual distinction is with some of them. If you look at the constraints in a franchise and the constraints in a management contract,
yeah,
sometimes it's and the exclusions of liability, etc., and the de-risking for the brand, you do wonder whether it's just a slightly glorified franchise. But then again, you know, with your traditional third-party operators, I think some of them are almost too close to the brands. So it's that's a whole mess that let's not get into on this particular call, incriminating myself. But I do think there are certain things where a brand helps. I think on ESG advancement and things like that, a brand is a great help. And I think working with a brand that is active and has its owners as well as its guests in mind, it can be very helpful. But I think that the bigger they get, sometimes they lose sight of some of that. So I think I can understand the benefits of a franchise model, but I agree with you in terms of the management contract approach.
And especially how complex management contracts became, right? And how overly complex, and trying to make it a hybrid lease, for example, or using other forms of guarantee. I think that's all been found out, as you described, when COVID hit, everyone looked at their contracts across their portfolio and actually realized what they had wasn't a lease, it was a management contract, but it was disguised as a lease, or there was a lot of kind of caveats in contracts which suddenly came called out. So I think going forward, there'll be a lot more simplicity in the relationship between the owner and the operator, because
I hope there will be.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to happen that
less
quickly,
legal fees,
unfortunately, but it's nice to see that the will and intent are there. So it's
more transparent relationship, at least.
I think
it's not simple.
I think that it's probably very relevant to consider the skill base behind the management contracts. I can hear plenty of managers asserting that they will bring particular skills, and I think that it's very evident just looking in the patchy nature of the recovery in London, where there have been skills and thought and management applied to how to recover out of a very difficult situation. Sort of, if you like, applying obviously systems that are very much up to speed, like Duetto revenue management systems or whatever else, but also that kind of the thought behind it. How do you manage to recover in an extremely complex situation? And that's where I think management skills. I think that, and for the training and development and all of that kind of support, I think that's another area again. I think they really do have a place, and I think they will be valued more and more.
Absolutely. As we touched upon before, we lost a lot of people through COVID in terms of changing careers from hospitality to something else. I think there's, you've touched on it, Louise, in terms of where have all the staff gone. Massive issue for all our franchisees that are now opening hotels. And actually, as a franchisor, typically you wouldn't get involved in that because that's their business. But actually, they're asking for us as a chain with obviously a global network to actually provide extra support in recruitment and training and all of that. So I think that's also a shift in the dynamics of the industry.
Thank you all. I mean, we have hit our allotted 1 hour session. I'm sure we could have carried on this conversation and spun off and talked about many other different topics, but we must close up for today. But thank you so much for your insights shared thus far. So later this week, on Thursday, the 30th of September, I'm hosting a webinar in partnership with Cvent called The Comeback of Events, Are You Ready? And the link to this webinar to register will be posted in the chat. And with the comeback of events, we at Boutique Hotel News, Service Department News and Short-Term Rentals are super excited to bring you the Urban Living Festival on the 26th and 27th of October next month at Tobacco Dock in London. It's 1 month away. We do not have very long to go. And here are some of our speakers that are going to be at the Urban Living Festival. We've heard from Gerard Nolan today. And we've delighted to offer you a 20% discount for tickets for our attendees today, which again has been popped into the chat. We would absolutely love to see you there. And if you would like to hear further information about Urban Living Festival, please do get in touch with my colleague Katie. Her name, her email address, her phone number is up on your slide now, and I believe her LinkedIn profile will also be popped into the chat for you to connect. But that is all from us for now. Thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you to our Trailblazers for sharing their insights and their experiences. And thank you to Cvent and Aperto for sponsoring today's session. If you'd like to stay in touch, you can follow us on social media. However, we are going to leave the chat open for an extra 2 minutes for any of you to follow up on any of the links that have been popped into the chat today. But otherwise, do take care, enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll see you very soon.
Thanks all.